Okay, so I mean, that's interesting, and that allowed people to maybe view Spider-Man a little bit early, but I mean, what is the connection between this and fintech? This isn't really like a fintech case.
Yeah, so that's a great question. I think this case, the Sony hack, leads into kind of broader questions about data and security, and I think those are things that we want to talk about in the context of this module. But I think, one, in terms of fintech, we like to think if something has crypto in front of it, somehow it's maybe more secure than other forms of finance or data or other spheres of finance that we're maybe involved in.
It's like we don't understand it, so we assume other people don't too.
Perhaps,
yeah.
Right? We have cryptocurrency, Bitcoin being probably the most representative of cryptocurrencies at the moment. And even then, we know that participants related to the cryptocurrency market have been hacked, right? So probably the most foremost example of that is there was an exchange called Mt. Gox that was based in Japan. At the time, it handled most of the cryptocurrency transactions in the world. They ended up being hacked and losing their Bitcoin, valued at billions of dollars, and eventually they went bankrupt. And so that's a very direct example of how cybersecurity issues still are very relevant, even to things in fintech that we think may be secure, right? So that's the first point. I think the second point is a little bit more broader in the sense that as fintech and different types of applications of it become much more widespread, and populations that maybe didn't have access to traditional forms of finance now do through not having to go to a brick and mortar bank, but accessing banking services through their phones, right? Yeah. You would assume that a lot of these populations maybe were not as technologically sophisticated. And so as they get exposed to these new technologies, their concept of cybersecurity and how to protect their data will become an issue too. And they can potentially be a population at risk in terms of hacking and cybersecurity. So this is why this is a very important topic that goes hand in hand or in parallel to advances in technology and fintech.
So one of the things that I think often comes up is when these types of things happen, it's who owns the data, but also who's responsible for this. So in the Sony case, what happened to Sony? Did they get in trouble for this at all? Like, was there any liability on their part?
Well, there's no criminal liability that we know of. But we know from a civil liability standpoint, meaning somebody filing lawsuits, that there were a number of lawsuits against Sony saying, hey, you should have been more responsible for how you protected that data than you were.
So is this customers, employees, shareholders, all the above?
So I think my understanding is the majority of the cases that were brought against Sony were generally former employees who probably had much more data with Sony because they had employee records and different personal information that ended up getting exposed.
Yeah.
But if you think about it, that information is about you individually or individual people, but it's being held by somebody else. So who actually owns that data?
Right.
Does Sony own that data? Do you own that data if it's about you? Because that idea of ownership then links into the idea of responsibility, which then links into the idea of protection. And then understanding that gives us a more comprehensive approach to trying to figure out who actually has a responsibility to protect all of this data.
And it doesn't seem like either from a regulatory standpoint, certainly from an ethics standpoint, we really answered those questions yet.
Yeah.
Right?
Really quick on the ownership and liability, it's very interesting that in many situations, certain kind of social media, social networking services that users will post different types of personal data to, be it pictures, be it stories, be it videos.
Yeah.
Frequently, these social media services, these social networking services, will actually say they don't own the data.
Yeah, yeah.
But they will say that they are licensing the data from
They don't want the responsibility
so
of
perhaps
ownership.
they don't want that.
Yeah.
And then that creates all kinds of questions. Well, if we own the data now, then do we have to pay you for that data? But so frequently the way they navigate this somewhat thin line is you still own your data, but you've licensed it to us by virtue of you using our platform. And then in that situation, they can use it like they have owned it. But maybe they don't have the same responsibilities as protecting it.
Yeah.
And so this, again, raises a number of questions.